If you're wondering how you can be happier in your life, perhaps you should be studying Finland and the Finnish policies and try to learn from them. Why? Because this Nordic country has a newfound fame. Finland was ranked the happiest country in the world for 4 years consecutively in 2021. Even during the coronavirus pandemic, Finland has managed to retain its position as the world's happiest country in the World Happiness Report released by the United Nations Sustainable Development Solutions Network. But it is not only on the happiness index that Finland has performed well, it has also ranked highly in many other global indices such as education, gender equality, democracy, innovation, competitiveness, and work-life balance, and also many, many more. So now the question is, why is Finland so happy and why does it perform so well in so many global indices? And also, what can we learn about happiness and development from Finland? Today, I will be discussing these with my guest. Hi, this is Mahmoudul Islam. I'm a Finnophile journalist and writer here in Bangladesh. As a Finnophile, I take great interest in Finland and everything Finnish. I have been writing about Finland on my blog for several years, and my writings on Finland have also been published in newspapers in Bangladesh and India. One of the burning passions in my life as a Finnophile is to tell Finnish stories to the world. Today, I have with me a distinguished British academic. Danny Dorling is the Halford Mackinder Professor of Geography at the University of Oxford. His work concerns issues of housing, health, employment, education, wealth, and poverty. He has written many academic papers and books. Some of his books include Slow Down, Inequality and the 1% and Finntopia, which came out in 2020. It is actually through the book Finntopia that I came to know about Danny and his works. So hi, Danny, welcome to my program and thanks for joining me.
Thanks ever so much for having me. Thank you.
Yep. Okay, great. So now I will be asking you the first question. You wrote the book Finntopia, and it's actually a great book. I read it. It's actually very balanced because it tells everything about Finland from the positive side and also from the negative sides. So I want to know what inspired you to write Finntopia and why did you get the idea of the book?
The idea of the book came from doing a talk in the city of Cambridge in England, where I'd been asked to talk about inequality in Britain. And Britain is one of the most unequal states in Europe. And it's a fairly depressing talk to give when you say, look at our schools and differences between them, look at our incomes, look at the health situation, look at how bad our infant mortality is in England compared to most European countries. And at that talk in Cambridge, there was a student called Aniga Koljonen, who was from Finland. And I was showing these league tables within Europe, and Finland very often was at the top. And I was talking to Anika about this later and said, why don't we do a summer project and actually, let's try and work out what works and what doesn't work in Finland. Because whenever you talk about a country that does well, people in that country immediately say, oh, but you're forgetting about this and this and this, which is bad in our country. So Anika and I thought we'd have a go at doing this. Initially, we were going to compare England and Finland, and the book was going to be called England and Finland. And then we just threw away the England bit. And we decided just to look at Finland on its own, at all the statistics we could find, to try to work out what Finland was so good at, what it wasn't good at, and then the hard bit, trying to work out why Finland had got to this position in the world.
Okay, yeah, great. So my next question is, as we know, Finland was ranked the happiest country in the world for 4 years consecutively. So what will happen if Finland loses its top position on the happiness index in 2022, this year, after holding the ranking for 4 years consecutively? How do you think this will affect the happiness of Finns?
Ironically, if Finland were to lose the top spot, I think it would make Finns very happy. And it sounds strange to say that, but from the point of view of Finns, although Finns are very proud of how well Finland does in the world with so many things, it can be a bit annoying to have journalists repeatedly turning up and saying, so why are you so happy? And of course, these indexes are very marginal. The next country down to Finland is only fractionally less happy on the index. So I think Finland would actually celebrate becoming second or third rather than first to another country. And that sounds strange. We'll have to wait to see. I mean, Finland cannot carry on being at this point every year after year after year, but it's almost certainly going to stay up there in that group of countries which do best in the world.
Yep, exactly. And I guess, as you said, it will actually make Finns happy, because Finns are not obsessed with these kind of rankings, and they're not obsessed with these kind of statistics, and they're always trying to downplay their achievements in all these global indices. Whenever something comes up in any global, and they're at the top or near the top, and they try to find something. Maybe there were some errors in the methodology of that index, and they are like that. So it's always
in a way that they're like the opposite of Americans.
Yeah.
This is to stereotype Americans a bit, but Americans will often talk about how great America is and so on, the United States, without referring to statistics, because on almost no statistics is the United States doing particularly well. But people in USA are, often want to talk about how great their country is. And then the Finns, it's not just Finland. In the rest of the Nordic countries, you get this, but also in Japan, which is quite a successful electoral country, you get the same thing. People don't shout about the achievements, and that might be partly why they're so good, because they're not driven by pride, they're practical. And also, really importantly, they spot the problems. They spot the problems in society, see the problems, and try to solve and improve the problems. Whereas countries which are very unhappy, very unequal, with very poor health, often don't see that they're like that. And so because they can't see they've got a problem, they don't begin to try to tackle that problem.
Yeah, exactly. And it's kind of like that. Like, Finns are more concerned about, pragmatically solving a problem rather than topping any kind of index or, these kind of global indices, because they're focusing on the problem and they try to get the solution. It doesn't matter if they top any index or not, because they don't focus on that. They're just only focusing the problems and trying to, make things better.
Oh, yes.
So I think,
and it's a small country. It's on the edge of Europe, the edge of the world. It does have quite a diverse economy, which is very useful for it. There's many things, but it relied on Nokia at one point, and when Nokia, the phone company, did badly, that was not good for Finland. It's one of the world's producers of cruise ships, and with the pandemic, of course, there's less need for cruise ships, and cruise ships aren't necessarily a great thing. So, Finland's position is not assured. It's not like, say, Switzerland, sitting in the middle of Europe with all the benefits geographically of that and so on, and the financial centres. Finns actually have to work hard to be successful, and they don't take it for granted. But the fact that the Finns have been successful and are happy and are so good in so many social areas kind of shows that it's possible almost anywhere, if you really wanted to do it, to have the achievements of Finland.
Yep, exactly. So Finland is a remarkable phenomenon in terms of development on so many fronts. And it seems to be a utopia. But in your book named Finntopia, you said it several times in your book that Finland is actually not a utopia. You also said Finns have worked to build a better world with far more rigor and determination than any other nation on the planet. And they're well aware that there is still room for improvement. So can you elaborate a bit on that? Why do you say that?
Yes, I mean, in the book, we are mainly comparing countries that are affluent. But this kind of includes China and so on. And the world is rapidly changing on that. Finland was 100, 200, 300, 400 years ago, the poorest part of Europe by far. It was a colony of Sweden, a colony of Germany, a colony of Russia. People were oppressed for decade after decade. If you could, you left Finland. You went to the United States, to Canada, to anywhere. And Finland, as much of northeast, Eastern Europe had 100 years ago, civil wars, a terror associated around the time of the First World War, revolution, fighting. And the Finns slowly kind of built themselves together out of that in a way that other countries didn't do quite so successfully. and it's hard to say why, but I'll just very quickly, and of course somebody has to end up in this position. Being partially on the losing side in the Second World War, or say in the Second World War, Russia, the USA, the UK, are quite unequal countries. Because the victors in war kind of keep their elite. The same people end up ruling after the wars before the war, and they tend to have more of the wealth and so on and want to keep it. When you lose a war, as in Finland's case, your elite are replaced, you don't trust the people in charge, you have to work together more. But also Finland worked out that if it didn't look after people who were the poorest, they would carry on leaving. And you have a problem with the population then. And so the Finns began to concentrate in the 50s and 60s on their society more. They had free school meals since the Second World War. You know, every child gets free meals at school. And also in Helsinki, free food through the summer holidays. So there is, you know, and we're arguing about that in England now, whether we do that. We have children starving in England. It's ridiculous. But then in the 60s and 70s, they kind of went up a gear, particularly with education, and worked out that they needed to provide slightly more to the children who do worse at school. Again, to stop them leaving the country apart from anything else, but also to make the country more productive. They had an advantage in a way by being in the Cold War right next to the USSR. They could kind of stay neutral, stay out of the USA's sphere of influence quite so much because they were that close. You know, these are coincidences that have nothing to do with the Finns. But in the 1980s and 90s and 2010s, particular people, particular groups, political parties and so on, clearly really fought very hard for social progress, and they won as much as it was possible to win in those decades in the world, and created and maintained a welfare state that's produced a current prime minister. She's only in her 30s, I think, and she relied on that welfare state to get through life when she was a child, and is now in charge of the country, along with 4 other women from 4 other political parties in a grand coalition. You know, if you were writing a kind of fairy story in the 1980s about what a successful country might be in the future, and you wanted to get it right, the story of Finland would be the one that you'd actually make the movie of.
Exactly. Yeah. So my next question is, a large part of Finland's success has resulted from its policies that strongly prioritize equality and egalitarianism. These policies have not only created a fair society, but also a happy one, as the index shows. Besides, more equal societies rank highly on the happiness index than the less equal ones. And also, you wrote it in your book that in just a little more than half a century, Finland has become one of the most equitable places in the world. So, why do you think is equality so important for happiness?
I mean, the kind of happiness questions you use here are, all things considered, how happy are you? And part of why Finland does so well on happiness is that the population are quite good at realizing what you can have, what's possible. Whereas in other countries, and in more unequal countries, then what is possible is often the winning the lottery ticket, you know, becoming a celebrity. You know, I would be really happy if I had several $1 million. I would be really happy if I was famous on TV. Now, obviously, clearly, only a tiny number of people can ever be in those situations. But if you're in a very unequal country, it matters more to have the dream that one day you could be like that, because the future and for your children looks awful otherwise. And that makes people unhappy, because they're wishing for something which is utterly impossible. And even worse, when they think it's utterly impossible, somebody on telly tells them, "Oh no, if you just try hard enough, you can be in the 1%." You know, in a more equal country, the 1% have far, far less. In Finland, it's only about 6% of all income, just 6 times the average. In my country of England, it's nearer to 16%. And that's huge. That's an enormous chunk of money. In America, it's 1/5 of all income to the top 1%. But in Finland, it's only 6%. So it's not that different being in the top 1% as the 2% or the 3% in Finland. it's not that different being in the bottom of the top third as being in the top 10th. And if you're in the bottom half, and half the population always have to be in the bottom half, that's, and the Finns are good at maths. We're not so good at maths in more unequal countries. But if you're in the bottom half in Finland, you get brilliant free health services, you get brilliant education, you get higher salaries than the bottom half anywhere else in Europe. You get more choice over what days you choose to work or hours than anywhere else over Europe, as much choice as people in the top half get. And people are happier because it's not so awful. I mean, and it isn't, or here's a way of thinking about it. Imagine you have a family with many brothers and sisters. And imagine that one or two of those brothers and sisters are really favoured, and the parents give them everything and they don't give the others much. Imagine, you can see how unhappy that family would be. And now think of a family in which the parents try to treat the children equally. And the children are happier. A state is not that different. And in a way, and the Finns, and this is true to much of the rest of the Nordic countries, have an innate sense of fairness, of what's right, which comes from having grown up under great equality, which means they defend it, but it also makes them happy. And that innate sense of fairness doesn't exist in more unequal countries, where instead people have a sense that's bashed into them of survival of the fittest. You should try and get whatever you need or want and push and stamp over other people. And don't worry if you hurt them. That's their fault. Which is an awful attitude to have, which no wonder things go wrong in these more unequal, more unhappy countries.
Yeah. And what's the history of equality in Finland? Has it always been an equal country historically?
No, not at all. 100 years ago, in the 1920s, it was one of the most unequal countries of Europe. It had an aristocracy who had most of the wealth and income. People were almost kind of bonded labor at the very bottom of society. And it wasn't really until the 60s and 70s that it began to become noticeably more equal, and that continued. So this isn't a rich tradition of equality in the past in Finland. One ironic thing that happened is that particular Finnish politicians in the 1960s visited the United Kingdom. We were the second most equal country to Sweden then in the 60s in the UK in Europe. And they visited the USA in the 60s, where you're beginning to get campaigns for equal rights and so on. And they copied the ideas from the USA and the UK in the 60s into Finland and improved on them. They copied the educational ideas from Britain. At least some of that work that happened in the UK and the USA, which ultimately failed, was ignored and has been thrown away. At least another country got to use it and showed that it actually works and produces incredible results. Finland has the lowest infant mortality rate the world has ever seen for human beings. And that's by copying ideas from other countries about decent healthcare, and not just decent healthcare, but decent social security and housing, particularly for women, so that no woman's in a position where they're likely to be suffering from health and environmental damages, to make it more likely that they lose their baby after they're born. It's an incredible achievement, the lowest infant mortality rate in the history of the human species. And that was just a few years ago in Finland.
Okay, yeah. And as you said, like Finns copied the ideas from England. So in terms of equality, and they worked on that, then they improved. So it's kind of like that Finland and the Nordic countries became more and more equal after 1960s, 60s, and 70s and 80s. Whereas the countries they copied the ideas from gradually became more and more unequal.
Yeah.
Say, for example, England. Is it?
Yes.
Okay, and why is that, do you think?
Okay. Just to correct myself slightly, in the 80s, Finland and Norway and so on did become slightly more unequal, but they were robust enough to begin, in Finland's case, to reverse that when they saw it happening. England and the USA is trickier. The equality came and it rose. In the US, when the soldiers came back from the Second World War, they demanded greater equality. The same happened in the UK. But the rich families were always there in the 50s and the 60s angry that ordinary people were going to university and so on. And they wanted to change this, or at least in the case of the USA, to charge people hundreds of thousands of dollars now to go to university. And in the case of the UK, they didn't like the idea that people were able to amass wealth and become secure. So they rebuilt a giant private rented sector again. You know, the majority of young adults will never have a mortgage. They'll have to pay rent to a landlord for the rest of their lives. Their parents and grandparents didn't. And I think it's a legacy of the past. I think it's the fact that the US is the most powerful country in the world with some of the most powerful, richest families in it. And the UK was the centre of the biggest empire the world has ever known. And the rich families of the UK were, if you like, the kings of empire. They got wealth from abroad, which was unknown in human history. And they left a legacy amongst their own families of the idea that that was okay, that some people should have much, much more than others. Now, you don't have any of that in somewhere like Finland. You don't have a set of families who were incredibly wealthy. You do have families who had a lot in the 1920s, but you know, a lot in Finland in the 1920s was not the same as a lot in England in the 1920s or in the USA. And they didn't leave, they haven't left a legacy, a social class, if you like, of their children determined to bring back the inequalities of the past, because they somehow think that it was justified that their families had so much more than other people. And also, if you think about the USA, people were taught not to see other people as people. In the USA, of course, slavery was the most extreme way that happened. But in the UK, the most common job for a woman 100 years ago was to be a servant. You didn't see the lower classes necessarily as human like you. It was fine to have them cleaning at your house and living in the attic, which of course you'd never want for your own children. So these historical legacies really matter. And you see it now in two generations of Finns who are so used to being treated fairly and equally that they're shocked when they see people who are not. And in contrast, in unequal countries, I talk to children in schools in England who don't know that there was a time when there were not homeless people on the streets in England. When I was growing up in England, there were hardly any homeless people. Now you'll see homeless people almost everywhere. Of course, in Finland, there are no homeless people on the streets. Right? You know, and it changes what shocks you, because you can become used to inequality and you can think it's okay. And there are people who argue that it is okay, of course, which makes it even worse.
Yep, exactly. I understand. So now my next question is, there was inequality in the Finnish education system in the 1960s, and it changed when they instituted reforms in the 1970s. They created the 9-year comprehensive school system that actually prioritized equity instead of excellence. Now, for one thing, this created highly educated citizens in Finland, but also Nordic academics in the World Happiness Report 2020, they wrote that Nordic countries investing heavily in universal and free education might be an important underlying factor in the high happiness levels that these countries presently enjoy. So my question is, if the Finns have shown that educational equity has so many positive effects, why are not other countries emulating them? And why do nations, including England, focus more on competition, standardized testings, and school rankings instead of just ensuring equity?
A really good question. It's the difference of seeing the common good, what is good in general, as opposed to what might be good for your own family. So in England, if you're pretty affluent, say you're in the top 5%, you could afford to send your child to a private school. And these are very rare in most of Europe, but there's 7% of children in England go to a private school. And you can pay money, and you'll pay more. Of course, you wouldn't send your child to a private school which wasn't better resourced as compared to a state school. And you can give your child an advantage, more teaching, more attention, so they get higher grades. And if you're doing that, and remember the very best of people in England are doing that, well, selfishly, do you really want the children whose parents are not paying to do better and compete with your child? Or would you be happy if the actual amount of money spent on the state school stays low? so that your child has got a better advantage, more chance of going to a good university, more chance of getting a better paid job. And it's this selfishness that drives the belief in inequality in education. And it's not just in the private schools. The state schools in somewhere like England vary dramatically by how much the housing costs around each state school, and the same in the USA. Finland took a step back. Finland was like this in the 1950s and 60s, and they took a step back and they just realized how detrimental it was to do this. And they put in more investment, more money in the schools which were not doing so well. They don't publish the results of the schools in a kind of league table, because when you do that, middle-class parents flock towards the schools doing slightly better and the gaps widen. But they do monitor, although they give teachers an enormous amount of freedom and a lot of respect. And the result, and it shocked the Finns, this was one of the first things that Finland came out on top in the international rankings. The result was that when you test Finnish children with standardized tests in problem solving, logic, mathematics, and linguistics and so on, they do incredibly well. They learn things well, they're happy at school. And they really learn. They learn properly, so that when you test them again at age 24, they can still do maths. Whereas in the competitive system, children do worse overall. They're not so good, and also they only learn how to pass the test on that day. So the level of maths is awful at age 24, say. Even worse with languages. It's embarrassing how many languages the average Finnish child can speak at 16 or at 18. You know, you're talking 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, properly speak. So why don't other countries do this? It's this question of vested interest again. And there's a nasty thing also beneath it, which is there are some people, often people who did have a lot of money spent on their education, who think that they are inherently cleverer than others. They've got clever genes, and their children will have clever genes. And they think other people are inherently stupid. So they think it would be a waste of money to treat people equally. And it's very, very sad. And hopefully we are getting out of that stupid belief, because it really, really is stupid. And of course, Finland shows it's stupid. Because if people were inherently stupid, well, how did the Finns manage to make all their children so able, so clever, so productive? Yeah,
Exactly.
it doesn't make sense. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Right. So now I have the last question for you. As we're talking about happiness, so this is a question about happiness. So how do you define happiness personally, and what are your sources of happiness?
I have come since looking at Finland to define it as what can you expect? How happy are you, all things considered? You know, what is possible? So, you know, I'm talking to you in the middle of, in effect, another lockdown in Britain. You know, but that's not my fault. You know, it's happened. It's annoying. But all things considered, the sun is shining outside the window very brightly. It looks like a lovely day. So you have to look at the sources. People vary dramatically, personally, on individual levels of happiness. And this is something where there are probably genetic differences, unlike ability to learn. You know, some people are much more naturally happy than others. Some people will find life difficult. It also varies by age. And this is bad news for you, but good news for me. You know, I'm in my mid-50s now. And happiness rises after age 50. It falls to age 50 on average. As people, you know, life becomes harder, bigger responsibilities, parents become older, you have children. But from age 50 onwards, happiness levels increase. Now, just knowing that actually makes me happy. But lastly, I tend to get happy by going out and about and seeing other people and meeting people. So it's great to see you, and it's great to be able to do this way.
Yep. Okay. Thank you, Professor. So now I want to wrap up the meeting. It was great talking to you, and thanks for joining me. Thank you very much.
Thanks ever so much for having me. Thank you.
Yep. Thank you. Goodbye.